Inside the U.S. Capitol, Ron DeSantis ambushes Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett in a nationally televised hearing, accusing her of riding on identity, not merit, to gain power. He waves a shadowy document and demands she justify her entire career. But just minutes later, a former law school dean storms in and drops irrefutable evidence that exposes DeSantis's own hypocrisy and rewrites the room. The crowd doesn't just shift, they freeze. If this is what one truth revealed, how many careers have been built on silence and lies? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The hearing room looked polished, but the air was thick with tension. Officially, the session was titled Academic Standards and Fairness in Federal Hiring. But everyone knew what it really asked. Who earned their place and who was just allowed in? Ron DeSantis entered like a man stepping onto a battlefield, not a panel. He didn't smile, didn't greet. He brought a folder stamped qualifications and the confidence of someone who came not to speak, but to accuse. Every move, his tie, his notes, was sharpened for confrontation. Across from him sat Jasmine Crockett, still, composed, and silent. Her blazer was charcoal, her notebook navy, but her presence eclipsed every detail. She was there to speak on the quiet dismantling of scholarships and support for students from underprivileged backgrounds, but everyone knew she was also there as a target. Her life, rising from public schools to law school on scholarship, then to Congress, was seen by some not as success, but as evidence of a rigged system. She didn't blink, didn't flinch. No grandstanding, just a calm hand on paper, like someone who's spent a lifetime learning how to listen before striking. They had clashed before, on air, through veiled shots and clipped quotes. DeSantis once spoke of lowered standards wrapped in moral camouflage. Everyone knew who he meant. Jasmine responded once, quietly, "Some people inherit legacy. Others inherit silence. I made mine speak." Now they sat 12 feet apart, the room between them charged like a storm cloud. The chairwoman began to read the agenda, but no one was listening. The hearing had already started, without a word. And just as the room began to fall into the rhythm of formality, water glasses clinking softly, microphones humming low, Ron DeSantis leaned forward with the slow precision of someone who knew exactly when to strike. The shift in his posture was subtle, but it cut through the atmosphere like a drawn blade. He placed both palms on the polished desk, leaned into the mic, and spoke with a tone dipped in restraint, but sharpened with premeditation. "Madam Chair," he began, voice low, deliberate, almost clinical, "we are gathered today to evaluate the role academic merit plays in our hiring system. But I'd like to raise a more basic question, one that goes beyond policy and into principle." He paused, eyes drifting to Jasmine like a spotlight snapping to its mark. In recent years, we've seen a surge in public figures chosen not for their proven ability, but for the emotion their story evokes. We've traded competence for narrative. Struggle for some has become a substitute for skill. His words didn't rise in volume, but in weight. Every syllable felt like it was being nailed into the wood. The phrase "substitute for skill" hung in the air like a charge waiting to be read aloud. DeSantis didn't blink. "And I believe the American people deserve better than anecdotes wrapped in applause. They deserve facts. They deserve proof." He reached down and retrieved a crisp manila folder from his briefcase, holding it up like evidence in a courtroom. "With that in mind," he said coolly, "I'm submitting a formal request for Representative Jasmine Crockett to release her graduate thesis, as well as all official documentation verifying her academic qualifications, so that this committee and the public can judge for themselves whether her background meets the standards required to shape national hiring policies." The room froze, not with outrage, but with something far colder: calculation. Even the journalists who had come expecting fireworks looked briefly stunned. The question itself wasn't illegal. It wasn't even shouted. But what made it brutal was the elegance of its cruelty. He hadn't called her a fraud. He hadn't accused her of lying. He'd done something worse. He'd made her legitimacy a debate. The message was clear as glass. A woman like Jasmine Crockett didn't look like she belonged at the table. So surely there must be a file, a paper, a line of ink somewhere that could prove she did. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't flinch. But the insult, dressed as inquiry, had already been fired. It was a familiar weapon, wrapped in civility, wielded by men who understood that the sharpest attacks were the ones that came wrapped in just asking. Around the room, people shifted, some with unease, some with quiet approval. A few committee members exchanged whispers. The temperature in the room hadn't changed, but it suddenly felt colder. He had said it without raising his voice, but he had shouted a deeper message. Your story isn't enough. Prove you earned this. And Jasmine, she didn't need to react, because in that moment, everyone in the room felt it. That old, relentless echo heard by those who had always been asked to bring twice the proof just to be seen as ordinary. He reached back into his folder, slower this time, as if carefully selecting a blade from a drawer full of scalpels. What he pulled out wasn't thick, just a single sheet of paper, unbranded, unsigned, and dangerous, not because of what it proved, but because of what it could suggest. This, he said, holding it between two fingers like a delicate accusation, was posted anonymously to a professional academic board frequented by former professors and law school staff. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. It claimed, or he continued, that in the past decade, several public figures may have received special academic considerations, not based on achievement, but on their demographic background, exceptions granted quietly, outside of formal policy. He let the words dangle in the air, heavy with implication, then added, we all want fairness, but we can't pretend every degree was earned the same way. He paused, glancing at Jasmine as if to say, I didn't say it was you, but I know what you're thinking. There are people in positions of real influence, he said, whose entire academic record has never been independently verified. I think that matters. There was no name in the document, no institution, no proof. And that was the point. DeSantis didn't offer truth. He offered doubt. The kind of doubt that doesn't need roots to take hold. The kind of doubt that sticks to the walls of rooms like this and lingers long after the cameras shut off. I'm not claiming this is verified, he added with faint humility, but given the discussion on credentials, I believe it warrants consideration. The audacity was surgical. He had weaponized ambiguity, engineered plausible deniability, and lobbed a loaded insinuation wrapped in procedure. The air shifted. A low murmur flickered through the room like static. A staffer in the third row tilted her head, unsure whether to lean forward or recoil. A junior reporter stared at the paper, eyes narrowing as if it might reveal something if she squinted hard enough. And DeSantis? He placed the document on the desk, centered, visible, and smoothed it once with his palm like a judge pressing down on a gavel. The damage wasn't in the document. It was in the act of needing to ask whether it could be true. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett didn't blink. She didn't lean forward or ask to see the page. Instead, she looked at DeSantis for half a second longer than necessary, measuring him, not reacting. Then she smiled. Not the kind you mistake for grace, but the quiet smile of someone who's heard this story before. Every version of it, from conference tables to street corners. A smile that didn't hide hurt, but revealed the weight of surviving through it. Slowly, she closed her Navy notebook, not with a snap, but with the calm of someone sealing a truth that never needed proving. Her hands were steady, her eyes unmoved, and not a single word left her lips. Yet somehow that silence spoke louder than anything she could have said. The room froze. What had been a space filled with scribbling pens and whispered commentary became airless. Even reporters paused mid-keystroke. The silence wasn't passive. It was pointed. And it wasn't aimed at Jasmine. It was aimed at everything this moment exposed. What DeSantis had offered wasn't curiosity. It was a wound wrapped in protocol. And Jasmine's silence? That was the mirror, held up not for herself, but for everyone else. In that single act, refusing to flinch, refusing to perform, Jasmine Crockett reminded the room that dignity doesn't argue. It simply waits until truth is no longer denied. And as the final echo of silence settled into the walls, all that remained was the waiting, the unbearable weight of a room holding its breath for her to crack, to flinch. to defend. Dozens of eyes locked on Jasmine Crockett like spotlights trained on a single unmoving figure center stage. Behind nameplates and cameras, behind notebooks and partisan instinct, there was only one question now. Will she speak? The tension crawled through every row, from senators to student observers, tightening around necks like invisible hands. One congressman leaned forward, elbow on table, lips twitching in anticipation. A young intern from Georgetown held her phone inches above her lap, quietly recording, convinced this was the moment that would go viral. Even the court reporter, trained to track every syllable, had paused for just a beat longer than she should have. The heat in the room wasn't from the lights, it was from implication. Everyone had heard DeSantis's message, but now they wanted to hear her defense. Not out of fairness, but out of expectation. It was always expected, wasn't it, that someone like her must earn her place twice and then explain how she got there a third time. But DeSantis wasn't finished twisting the knife. He leaned in again, voice smooth, deliberate, loud enough to be clipped and quoted. "We're not here for theatrics," he said. "We're here for truth. America doesn't need symbols. It needs standards." His gaze was locked on Jasmine like a prosecutor delivering closing arguments. "And if we can't ask questions in this room, where else can accountability exist?" A few heads nodded, slowly, almost guiltily. Others sat frozen, trapped between doubt and discomfort. What DeSantis had done wasn't just tactical, it was ancestral. It was the modern face of a question that's centuries old. "Are you really supposed to be here?" And still, Jasmine said nothing. Not yet. Her stillness had become its own resistance, its own storm. Then after a long moment that felt like it cracked open time, she finally turned toward him. Her voice when it came was soft, but every syllable struck like iron meeting stone. "Tell me, Senator," she said, eyes steady, "what exactly do you want me to prove?" She let the question settle before continuing. "A diploma?" Her tone didn't shift. "A grade? Or would you prefer something heavier?" She leaned in just slightly, not to intimidate, but to ensure he couldn't look away. "Would you like me to prove an entire life?" The room didn't breathe, because in those words there was no defense, there was no apology. There was only the quiet fury of someone who had carried the burden of proof for far too long and decided in front of the nation to hand it back. Just when it seemed the silence had settled into permanence, becoming part of the walls, the wood, the breathlessness of the air itself, a voice rose from the back, not loud, not angry, but unmistakably clear. He stood up slowly, almost reluctantly, as if he'd wrestled with the decision in real time and finally lost. The gallery seating creaked beneath him, a quiet groan that cut through the chamber like a snapped thread. All eyes turned, not toward the committee table, but toward the rows behind the press corps. There, near the edge of the back bench, a young man stood, straight-backed and wide-eyed. He couldn't have been older than 23. Tan skin, dark eyes, trembling hands. His suit didn't quite fit. His voice did. "I'm sorry," he began, not sounding sorry at all. "I know I'm not supposed to speak. I'm just a guest." He held a notebook to his chest, one corner dog-eared, a pen clipped to the top spiral. "But I'm also a law student. First year." The room didn't interrupt him. The committee didn't stop him, because something in his tone told them he had earned this moment. He turned his body slightly toward DeSantis, but not enough to provoke, just enough to signal direction. "And I came here to listen today, to learn how the system works, how policy is built, how leadership sounds when it's trying to be fair." He took a breath, not shaky, grounded. "But I keep hearing that degrees are everything, that titles are proof, that where you went to school says everything about who you are." His next words didn't rise in volume, but they hit like a car crash in a dead-still intersection. "So if education is the measure of leadership, Senator," he hesitated only once, then drove it home. "Why are the people with degrees from Harvard and Yale the ones cutting programs for students who look like me?" The question didn't erupt. It imploded. No names were spoken, but the impact was surgical. The gallery didn't stir. The dais didn't blink. No coughs, no scribbling, no whispers. It was as if the room itself had stopped breathing. What made it cut deeper was how gently it had been delivered. No venom, no theatrics, just a law student from a community perpetually excluded from the rooms where decisions get made, asking the one thing no one at the top ever seems ready to answer. The young man didn't sit down. He didn't need to. His presence, his voice, and his question now lived in the center of the hearing like a burning flag no one dared put out. DeSantis did not immediately respond, not because he didn't want to, but because for the first time all morning, he wasn't holding the tempo. The question hadn't been aimed at his record. It had been aimed at his worldview. And it hit. His thumb began tapping lightly against the edge of the folder in front of him, a subtle rhythm, barely audible. But Jasmine Crockett noticed it. So did two reporters in the second row. So did the student who had asked the question. Then came the sound DeSantis hated most. Not protest, not opposition, stillness. Stillness meant people were thinking, and thinking meant control had shifted. DeSantis shifted in his seat, adjusting his blazer by the lapel, a gesture too practiced to be subconscious. He leaned slightly toward the microphone, cleared his throat, and spoke. I believe, he began slower now, eyes not quite meeting the students, that protecting national standards is not the same as denying opportunity. His voice still held the polish of a politician, but the edge was gone. Something about his tone, just a little too defensive, a little too carefully chosen, betrayed the truth. He wasn't answering the question. He was retreating from it. We have to ensure excellence, he continued, this time glancing toward his prepared notes, as though they could offer refuge. If we lower our expectations for the sake of optics, we risk weakening the very institutions that make this country strong. It was a sentence composed in policy language, clean, hollow, designed to sound like leadership without actually leading. But no one applauded. No one nodded. Not even those who had agreed with him minutes earlier. Because now the contrast was too glaring. A student who spoke from experience had asked a question that went straight to the marrow. And a senator, armed with status, schooling, and staff, was answering like a man reading from a playbook that no longer applied. Even the press pool, which had been cycling through predictable camera angles and recycled quotes, had shifted focus. A CNN producer scribbled "student line" across the top of his notepad in all caps. A C-SPAN operator zoomed in, not on DeSantis, but on the student's face. The energy in the room had mutated. What had once felt like a predictable skirmish between ideological opponents had now turned into something raw, unchoreographed, and real. DeSantis looked down again, not dramatically, but with just enough duration to register as discomfort. When he looked up, his expression was no longer triumphant. It was taut, controlled, measured, but no longer commanding. He adjusted his microphone, even though it hadn't moved. I respect your question, he said flatly, a phrase as bloodless as the paper it would appear on in the transcript. But this conversation is about ensuring all Americans, regardless of background, receive the highest possible standard of leadership. It was a sentence engineered to say nothing, a parachute sentence, a reset button, but it didn't work because everyone in that room knew what the student had done. He hadn't thrown a stone. He had turned on a light, and in that light, the cracks were suddenly too obvious to ignore. DeSantis's voice trailed off, not into silence, but into something worse, irrelevance. Just as the chamber began to breathe again, tentative, uneasy, changed by the voice of one fearless student, a soft whisper at the front table shifted the current once more, like a match being struck in a room already drenched in gasoline. The staffer bent low, close enough to the chairwoman that even the nearest microphone couldn't pick up the words. Whatever he said was brief, 7 words, maybe 8, but they changed the entire room. The chair's pen paused mid-stroke. Her posture straightened, suddenly alert. One breath held in her throat, then slowly released. The committee notes before her, carefully ordered, highlighted, rehearsed, were no longer her focus. Her fingers gripped a small folded slip of paper, passed from the clerk's hand to hers. She stared at it for a full second longer than necessary, as if reading not words but consequence. And then she looked up. Her voice cracked only slightly at first, not from age or fear, but from the sudden realization that the hearing she thought she was leading had taken on a mind of its own. We've just received a request, she said, measured and controlled, though her eyes betrayed caution. A supplemental witness has contacted the committee, citing first-hand knowledge relevant to the discussion currently taking place. The room didn't move. Not yet. The chair took a breath, clearly deciding whether or not to continue. Then she did. Dr. Marlene Whitaker, former dean of the University of Texas School of Law. There it was. Not a gavel slam, not an outburst, but the emotional equivalent of thunder rolling across the floorboards of the Capitol. A visible wave passed through the audience section, heads turning, brows lifting, the sound of fabric shifting against chairbacks. For those who knew the name, it was like hearing the entrance of a long-withheld key witness. For those who didn't, it was the reaction of those who did that told them everything. In the middle of it all, Jasmine Crockett closed her eyes. Not dramatically, not performatively. She simply shut them in quiet acknowledgement, as though a part of her had been waiting for this moment and could finally say to herself, she came. The stillness in her body didn't read as relief. It read as the weight of something long carried, now beginning to lift. Not off her shoulders, but into the light where it could be seen by others. To her, Dr. Whitaker was more than a title. She was a witness to memory, a protector of facts that had been too often revised, buried, or conveniently forgotten. She had been there, in the classroom, in the quiet offices, in the closed-door conversations that shaped the trajectories of students others only saw once they were on TV. But to Ron DeSantis, the name meant something else entirely. He didn't flinch, not outwardly, but he shifted, a slight, almost imperceptible movement, a muscle tightening along his jaw. His fingers, previously relaxed atop a sheet of prepared talking points, began to curl slightly, the thumb tapping once, then twice in a staccato rhythm that betrayed calculation. His eyes narrowed, not in confusion, but in recalibration. Something in him had changed. Jasmine saw it immediately. So did 3 reporters. So did one intern seated at the far back row, who instinctively wrote down, DeSantis rattled? Because this wasn't just any witness. This was his past, too. He knew the name. He remembered the context. And whatever control he believed he still held over the narrative, through press-tested language in deliberate ambiguity, had just been shaken by the possibility of first-hand memory entering the record. This was no longer a battle of credentials. It was about to become a confrontation of facts. Aides seated behind the panel leaned toward one another, whispering behind their hands. A CNN producer mouthed, "She's really here?" A Fox News correspondent stiffened in her seat, typing a new lead into her live blog. Surprise witness at Crockett DeSantis hearing. Former dean steps in. And Jasmine? She opened her eyes slowly. No dramatics, no shift in posture, just a subtle, almost imperceptible lift of the chin. She didn't look at the chair. She didn't look at the crowd. She looked straight ahead, like someone bracing for a tide they already knew was coming. Because this wasn't about saving her. It was about telling the truth out loud and letting the room hear it from a voice no one could dismiss. And for the first time since he walked into that chamber, Ron DeSantis no longer looked like the architect of the moment. He looked like a man who suddenly realized the script was no longer his to read from. And then, as the chamber doors opened with a soft mechanical hush, something shifted, not just in the air, but in the spine of the room itself. People didn't turn just to look. They turned to brace. Dr. Marlene Whitaker walked in with the composure of someone who didn't need to ask for authority because she was the authority. No aide followed her, no stack of notes in hand, just a sealed folder and a spine made of iron memory. Her gray hair was pinned neatly, her dark coat hung straight, and her silence said, "I came prepared to be the last word, not another voice." She approached the microphone with the calm of a surgeon, and when she spoke, her tone wasn't loud. But the room leaned in like it was gospel. "Thank you, Madam Chair," she began. "I am Dr. Marlene Whitaker, former dean of the University of Texas School of Law. I'm here not to debate, but to clarify, because I taught both Representative Jasmine Crockett and Senator Ron DeSantis. And I remember them both, clearly." A quiet exhale swept through the room. She reached into her folder and pulled out a single essay, held in a protective sleeve. This, she said, lifting it like evidence, is a final paper written by Jasmine Crockett for my public policy and ethics course. Its title, Public Policy and the Hidden Truth. She submitted it on the morning her mother was admitted to intensive care for late-stage heart failure. Murmurs stirred. Someone shifted in their seat. Whitaker didn't blink. She didn't ask for an extension. She didn't tell anyone. She sat in a hospital hallway overnight, typing through beeping monitors, writing through grief. Her eyes were swollen, her hands were shaking, and she still handed in the paper. Edited, formatted, on time. I know this because a nurse called me out of concern. Jasmine hadn't moved in 14 hours. She placed the essay on the table like a sacred object. Then with calm precision, she drew a second document. Senator DeSantis enrolled in my comparative legal systems course during a semester exchange. He requested exemption from the International Law Unit. His reasoning verbatim, this content conflicts with my America First worldview and does not reflect the type of governance I intend to practice. The words hit like stones tossed into glass. Whitaker placed the request beside Jasmine's essay. The exemption was granted, as were 2 deadline extensions, as was permission to miss the oral debate portion. He was articulate, but when challenged by ideas, he withdrew. Her voice lowered, not in volume, but in distance. The words came closer. I'm not comparing intelligence, she said. I'm comparing character. One of them worked through agony and gave me insight I still teach from. The other rejected material that made him uncomfortable and walked away. Her gaze swept the room. What defines readiness for public service? Is it ideology, or is it the ability to act with discipline when the world is falling apart? She looked to Jasmine, then back to the committee. She showed up when no one asked her to, when no one could ask her to. She bled for what she believed in, and still delivered. That's not performance, that's proof. Whitaker placed both documents side by side, not with anger, but with finality. You asked for evidence, she said. There it is, a life lived and a lesson dodged. And then, without a word more, she stepped back. And in that breathless moment, even history stood still. As Dr. Whitaker's final words from the previous statement lingered in the air like smoke refusing to clear, she remained in place, motionless except for the slight incline of her head, as if listening for something beneath the silence. And then, in a tone softened not by gentleness, but by gravity, she spoke again. There are 2 kinds of learners, she said. One learns to understand the world in all its discomfort, contradiction, and complexity. The other learns only what he can wield and discards what cannot be bent to his will. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't glance at DeSantis. She didn't need to. The entire room felt the shift. Not rhetorical, but ethical. Her words were not sharp for show. They were surgical, cutting straight into the marrow of the moment. A beat passed, then another. She adjusted her stance ever so slightly and continued. I'm not here to tarnish reputations or assign guilt, she said, but I must ask a question for anyone who claims to represent the gold standard of excellence. If your confidence is rooted in achievement, why fear the disciplines that challenge you? Why step away from the classroom when the content does not conform to your narrative? A flicker ran through the audience. Students, aides, senators. Some leaned forward, others pulled back. A few, caught somewhere between discomfort and revelation, simply froze. Dr. Whitaker's voice dropped just 1 notch lower. Avoiding difficult knowledge is not discernment. It is retreat. And if you call yourself a guardian of standards, then you must be willing to stand inside those standards when they are uncomfortable. Otherwise, what you defend is not merit. It's mythology. The press pool had gone still. Not one camera clicked. Not one laptop tapped. What had begun as a policy hearing had now become something deeper, a reckoning between lived experience and rehearsed image. And Jasmine Crockett, still seated, still composed, had yet to speak a word. Her hands were laced together on the table, her shoulders square. Her gaze didn't wander, didn't engage in spectacle, and yet her silence had evolved. What was once restraint was now unmistakably resistance, a refusal not born of fear, but forged in countless moments like this, when dignity had to choose whether to shout or to endure. She didn't interrupt. She didn't blink. And somehow, the more she remained still, the more the chamber seemed to move around her, restless, uncertain, exposed. Because in that moment, her silence was not absence. It was indictment, not against one man, but against a system that demanded performance from the wrong people and obedience from the right ones. A silence that had learned to outlast slander. A silence that had sat in courtrooms, classrooms, emergency rooms, and never flinched. A silence that had been misread as passivity until it was finally recognized as power. Dr. Whitaker saw it. The audience felt it. DeSantis couldn't escape it. And so, as the room hung in suspended stillness, that unspoken truth rang louder than any declaration. Jasmine didn't need to raise her voice, because history had already done it for her. The silence had long since outlasted the moment. The hearing adjourned, the chairs were vacated, and the witnesses escorted out. But something had been left behind, clinging to the air like static after a lightning strike. It wasn't just tension, it was truth. And truth, when spoken plainly and allowed to echo in a room built to suppress it, does not dissipate. It multiplies. The clip surfaced barely an hour later, 93 seconds long, filmed on a handheld device by someone sitting 5 rows back, their fingers visibly shaking. It wasn't an official stream, no studio angles, no fancy edits. Just the raw image of Dr. Marlene Whitaker standing behind the microphone, her voice low, eyes steady, body unmoving as she delivered the line that cracked the internet in half. You don't need to shout when your truth is heavy enough to silence the room. That sentence alone would have been enough to spark interest, but it was what followed, what the camera captured just over her shoulder, that set the timeline on fire. Jasmine Crockett, motionless, regal, framed by a storm of implication and accusation, saying nothing, saying everything, her hands resting like stone, her face unreadable, her silence undeniable. Within 6 hours, the clip had been reposted by every major news outlet. First came the politics blogs, then civil rights activists, then law professors, then celebrities, and then the avalanche. By the next morning, it had been viewed over 47 million times. It wasn't just the reach, it was the comments. Not the casual chatter of trending content, but something different, something collective, something righteous. One comment, pinned to the top under a verified blue check mark, read, "She didn't need to raise her voice. History raised it for her." Another, "He brought papers. She brought presence, and presence won." A third, brutal in its simplicity, "She sat in silence, and the room choked on its conscience." And yet another, almost whispered, "Jasmine didn't need to defend herself. The truth stood up in her place." No memes, no irony, just reverence, comment after comment, thousands deep, all echoing the same realization. Jasmine Crockett had endured what few ever see on camera, an orchestrated attempt to erase her dignity under the guise of academic scrutiny. But she didn't flinch. She didn't fold. She let the weight of the moment crush itself. The clip exploded across platforms: Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, Reddit. A Harvard law professor stitched it with the words, "Show this in every first-year class." A Black mother in Atlanta posted, "I played this for my daughter before school. She cried, so did I." A Latina graduate student from UC Berkeley captioned it, "My mom came to this country with $14. I've felt this in every classroom since." And yet the most powerful amplification didn't come from celebrities or scholars. It came from silence. Because Jasmine still hadn't said a word, not online, not in a press release, not even a tweet. And in that silence, the nation filled in the blanks. Meanwhile, in newsrooms across the country, producers scrambled. Clips of the hearing ran on loop, but the usual partisan framing struggled to take hold. There was no shouting match to dissect, no soundbite war to reframe, no moment of rage to deconstruct. Just a still woman, and an elderly professor with perfect posture, and a single sentence that rang louder than any rebuttal ever could. Cable anchors hesitated. They couldn't paint Jasmine as angry. She hadn't spoken. They couldn't accuse her of deflection. She hadn't even blinked. All they could do was sit there and try to narrate a silence that had already swallowed the room. Even DeSantis's team seemed to falter. His spokesperson gave a half-hearted defense about standards in education, but the message fell flat. The internet had already drawn its conclusion, and it wasn't about degrees. It was about dignity. By noon the next day, campuses lit up. At Howard University, students gathered in the law library and played the clip on repeat, each time falling into a hush when the words landed. At New York University, a professor replaced her scheduled lecture with a discussion titled, "When Silence Becomes Strategy." At a high school in Phoenix, a 17-year-old girl paused the clip halfway through and said, "That's what I want to be when I grow up. I want to be the kind of person who doesn't have to fight to be real." And back in D.C., Jasmine Crockett sat alone in her office, the door shut, blinds drawn. She had said nothing publicly, not yet. She had nothing to correct, no narrative to salvage, no defense to construct. She just sat quietly at her desk, her phone buzzing once every 10 seconds with a new message. A colleague, a student, a journalist, her law school roommate, the mayor of Baltimore. Her eyes skimmed the headlines. When the truth doesn't need a microphone, the Crockett moment. Academic warfare and the power of composure. Silence as rebuttal. Jasmine Crockett redefines the rules. And then she saw it. A screen grab from the clip, already turned into a graphic and circulating across every platform. It showed her seated, unshaken, and beneath it, just 8 words. "You don't need to yell if you're right." She didn't save it. She didn't post it. She just closed the tab and looked out the window. Because she knew something that no algorithm could track. This wasn't the end of a hearing. It was the beginning of a shift. And in that shift, she hadn't claimed victory. She had held the line. The silence had already spoken. The clip had already burned its path through the internet. But as the world leaned in, waiting for retraction, clarification, or apology, only one person remained conspicuously silent. The man at the center of it all. Ron DeSantis' office didn't grant interviews. Not to NPR, not to CNN, not even to the conservative outlets that had once praised him for intellectual discipline and moral clarity. No television hits, no press appearances, no podiums. Just a terse, calculated statement emailed to inboxes across Washington. "We respect all perspectives expressed during the hearing and remain committed to educational standards that serve all Americans." It was bloodless, sanitized, meant to extinguish, but instead it only fanned the fire. Social media didn't read it as neutrality, they read it as retreat. And retreat, especially when paired with arrogance, has a smell to it. It lingers. Within hours, the hashtags flipped. What had begun as a conversation about standards morphed into a full-on reckoning. Rundra's silence as strength trended beside "Mash cowardice" in plain sight. Screenshots of DeSantis' face during Dr. Whitaker's testimony became memes, but not the kind that vanish overnight. These cut deeper. One showed him blinking too slowly, captioned, "When the room stops believing you." But it wasn't just the jokes, it was the witnesses. First came the journalists. One reporter who had attended the hearing in person wrote a column titled, "The Day Composure Outranked Power." In it, she described watching DeSantis glance down again and again at his own notes, as if looking for the exit hidden between bullet points. Then came the educators. A former law professor posted, "It's astonishing how much effort goes into discrediting people who've survived more in one semester than most of us do in a decade." And then, the most unexpected voice entered the conversation. A quiet Facebook post from a woman named Rachel Hanley, former law student, no public profile, no agenda, just a memory. "I was in Jasmine Crockett's class. I was drowning that semester, failing contracts, barely sleeping, dealing with my own mother's health issues. I didn't ask for help. I didn't have to." Jasmine noticed. She stayed after every class to explain things. "She retaught me an entire semester while her mother was dying. She never once made it about her. She didn't talk. She just did." The post was shared 780,000 times in 48 hours. At first, DeSantis' allies tried to reframe. A senior aide went on background to Politico, insisting the senator had been mischaracterized and taken out of context. But when pressed, the aide couldn't say what exactly had been misquoted, because nothing had been. The transcript was clean. The video uncut, the meaning unmistakable. He had suggested, whether by insinuation or implication, that credentials could be questioned based on how someone looked, and now the reckoning was public. Outside the Capitol, students began organizing teach-ins and vigils, not riots, not protests, just visibility. At Florida State University, a group of Black and Latino law students stood in front of the administration building with nothing but copies of their acceptance letters and transcripts taped to their chests. The sign above them read, "Does this count enough for you?" At the University of Texas, professors handed out red folders to students walking across campus. Inside each folder, a single sheet of paper with the words, "Truth doesn't tremble." Meanwhile, within the polished walls of DeSantis's press wing, the energy had shifted. What began as confidence turned to calculation, then paranoia, then internal panic. Staffers whispered about canceling appearances, drafting counterstatements, scheduling values tours in swing states to distract from the damage. But nothing landed. Every new effort to steer the narrative fell flat under the weight of the public's clarity. You tried to humiliate someone in plain sight, and they beat you by standing still. In D.C., the whispers turned into pressure. A senior member of the Education Committee called the office directly and asked, "Was that document even real?" When told it was an anonymous submission, the member replied, "You weaponized hearsay. That's not governance. That's gossip in a suit." Even donors started pulling back. A fundraiser scheduled for the following week was postponed due to scheduling conflicts. Translation, they didn't want the blowback, but perhaps the most devastating moment didn't come from a journalist, a colleague, or a student. It came from a former state judge, retired, soft-spoken, not known for controversy. He posted a single sentence on his rarely used social media account. "If a man can't recognize integrity when it stands before him, he's unfit to lead anyone else toward it." Jasmine Crockett still hadn't spoken. And yet, every hour, more people joined the growing chorus that surrounded her. Not with chants, but with receipts, personal stories, private memories, quiet truths. People who had once been tutored by her, mentored, hired, helped, watched her push through law school while waiting tables, helping her sister raise kids, attending hearings with exhaustion behind her eyes but fire in her spine. One comment beneath the judge's post read, "She didn't just earn her place, she carved it out of concrete." Another, "He had everything handed to him. She had to fight to keep what she earned." And when they stood in the same room, the world knew who the real one was. No matter how many press releases DeSantis sent out, no matter how many staffers spun new lines, no matter how many talking heads tried to both sides the exchange, the truth had crystallized. Jasmine Crockett had faced down insinuation not with outrage, not with defensiveness, but with presence. And DeSantis? He had brought doubt into a room and found himself drowned in a flood of remembrance. As the firestorm around DeSantis scorched his political facade and the nation whispered Jasmine's name with newfound reverence, the eye of the storm moved not outward, but inward. For amid the millions of voices raised in her defense, Jasmine Crockett herself said nothing. And in that deliberate, defiant quiet, something far more powerful was forming. It wasn't a press conference. It wasn't a tweet. It wasn't even a whisper behind closed doors. What came next wasn't strategy. It was a moment, a single photograph taken by a congressional intern who hadn't realized he was capturing history. It showed Dr. Marlene Whitaker, backlit by the afternoon sun, leaking in through the tall windows of the hearing chamber, her weathered hand resting gently atop a worn manila folder. The folder, half open, revealed the faint title of a student essay, "Public Policy and Hidden Truths, J. Crockett." There were no filters, no hashtags, just natural light casting a golden halo over paper that had survived both time and memory. Dr. Whitaker's fingers, aged and deliberate, seemed not to hold the essay, but to honor it, as if placing it down was not just an act of reference, but a benediction. Jasmine sat beside her in the frame, slightly out of focus, her head bowed, not in submission, but in remembrance. No applause, no reaction, no quote for the cameras, just a bowed head and closed lips. The moment broke open like a fault line. The photo went viral within 3 hours. Unlike the fiery clip of the hearing, this image didn't provoke arguments. It didn't need a caption. It simply lingered. Some called it the Quiet Testament. Others dubbed it Hands of Truth. But most just shared it without comment, as if it were too sacred for noise. A poet reposted it with the words, "This is what legacy looks like before it becomes legend." A librarian in Detroit wrote, "She didn't need a podium. She had proof." A retired judge in Charleston commented, "You don't need to win the moment when the moment wins itself." And perhaps most striking, a caption from an anonymous user read, "She was being measured by people who couldn't carry what she survived." Still, Jasmine Crockett said nothing. Reporters camped outside her office. Former classmates left voicemails. Activists asked for statements. Producers begged for interviews. But she didn't break. In that silence, it wasn't retreat. It was orchestration. 7 days passed. 7 days where the country turned her silence into scripture. Where essays were written in her name. Where the photo hung in law school halls. Where students carried printouts like prayer cards. 7 days where she watched, listened, waited, not for the noise to die down, but for the signal to be heard. Then finally, on the 8th morning, it came. No speech, no press release. Just one sentence posted to her personal account at exactly 6:45 a.m., with no image, no tag, no punctuation flourish. Just this: silence is not weakness. It is the space truth needs to echo. That line was not poetic, it was deliberate. And in its simplicity, it moved like an earthquake beneath the culture. In Chicago, a muralist painted Jasmine's silhouette beneath those words on a brick wall. In Los Angeles, students stood in silent circles at sunrise, repeating the phrase aloud once, then walking away. In New Orleans, a gospel choir opened their service with no music, just the sound of it being read in a call and response whisper. Silence is not weakness. It is the space truth needs to echo. And on the digital front, the response was electric. Thousands reshared it within minutes. Commentators wrote think pieces about the new language of resistance. One scholar compared it to the writings of Audre Lorde. Another said it reminded him of Baldwin. But the people who mattered most, the ones who had watched her stand alone, accused, measured, dismissed, didn't need literary comparisons. They understood instantly. She hadn't stayed silent because she was afraid. She had stayed silent because she had already spoken once, and the world simply wasn't ready to listen. So she gave it time. Somewhere across the country, in a dim university dorm, a first-generation college student saved the post as her phone background. Somewhere in a small town, a teacher printed it out and tacked it above her chalkboard. And somewhere else, in a congressional office where a career now trembled, Ron DeSantis read the line quietly to himself 3 times, and then closed the browser. No one remembers the names of those who shouted loudest in moments of scrutiny. But they remember who stood still. They remember who never needed to explain themselves to people who never intended to understand. And in that quiet revolution, Jasmine Crockett etched herself into something far greater than the record of a hearing. She etched herself into the memory of a nation still learning what power truly looks like. Not force, not retaliation, but restraint. Because real power isn't in the reaction, it's in the decision to let others hear their own conscience echo back at them. And Jasmine had just handed America a mirror so silent it could no longer look away. As Jasmine's single sentence echoed across campuses, courtrooms, and kitchen tables, a strange stillness took root. Not the silence of suppression, but the silence that follows when a hard truth finally settles and there's nothing left to argue. And in that stillness, something rare emerged. A national moment, not just of reckoning, but of reflection. It would have been easy to call it a viral moment, a congressional flashpoint, a policy debate that spun out of control, a sharp woman humbling a powerful man. But that wouldn't have been the truth. The truth was far messier, more painful, more beautiful. What the country had witnessed wasn't just a hearing. It was a slow, public unmasking of how deeply bias hides inside the language of respectability. It was the exposure of how suspicion often dresses itself in logic, and how a woman who should have been broken by insinuation became the still point around which the entire room unraveled. And that's the lesson. Not that Jasmine won, but that she never agreed to the rules of a game that was rigged from the start. Too often, women like Jasmine are told to prove themselves twice for every time they are questioned once, to carry transcripts, to memorize citations, to smile while being measured like artifacts behind glass. But Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't list her qualifications. She didn't sprint for a podium when the arrows came flying. She stood still. She let the weight of her lived experience speak where words would have collapsed. And in doing so, she taught a room full of lawmakers and a nation watching from behind screens what dignity looks like under siege. DeSantis had come prepared with doubt, not evidence, not inquiry, just the suggestion that her story couldn't possibly be enough, that no matter how hard she worked, how much she gave up, how often she showed up, there would always be a shadow cast behind her name, a question mark placed by those who were never questioned themselves. And Jasmine answered that question by refusing to answer at all. Because some things don't deserve your breath. Some accusations only grow if you water them with your defense. She let the silence make it clear. I know who I am. Do you? This moment wasn't just about Jasmine Crockett. It was about every student who stayed up through the night while working double shifts. Every mother who studied in hospital waiting rooms. Every black and brown scholar who was asked, "How did you get in?" As if presence itself required permission. And it was about the teachers who saw those students, like Dr. Whitaker, who dared to remember the truth when others tried to rewrite it. This was a lesson in remembrance and in resistance. For all the political operatives who thought they could corner her, what they failed to grasp was that Jasmine had never asked for acceptance. She had built something stronger. She had built authority, not granted by approval, but earned in the fire of reality. They wanted her to break, but she'd already been broken before, by life, by grief, by systems that asked for more and gave less. And each time she rebuilt quietly until her silence became more powerful than their outrage. The real takeaway? Sometimes the most radical thing you can do in a world obsessed with performance is refuse to perform, to let your scars show, to let your silence echo, to choose composure over combat because you know the fight is bigger than you. And because truth, when given space, doesn't need an army to rise. Jasmine reminded us that justice doesn't always roar into the room. Sometimes it walks in quietly and waits. And what about those who watched? The students, the parents, the professors? They didn't walk away with a headline. They walked away with a mirror. Because what Jasmine showed them wasn't just courage. It was proof that the world changes not through explosive confrontations, but through unwavering presence in the face of slow, deliberate erasure. She showed them how to hold the line, not by shouting louder, but by standing still when others hope you'll flinch. Somewhere, a young girl watched that hearing and realized for the first time that her voice doesn't have to be raised to be heard. Somewhere else, a college student stopped apologizing for being in a room he earned his way into. And somewhere deeper, beneath the noise of politics and polls, something shifted in how we talk about merit, worth, and who gets to be enough. Because that was the real fight. Not about policy, not even about the past, but about who gets to belong without having to justify every inch of their presence. This wasn't about winning a debate. It was about reclaiming narrative, about saying, you don't get to define me. You don't get to erase what you were never willing to see. And in doing that, without theatrics, without rage, Jasmine Crockett didn't just reclaim the hearing room. She reclaimed a piece of America that had gone numb. And in a culture addicted to sound bites, her silence turned out to be the one truth no one could scroll past. That's the legacy of this story. That truth, when it's lived, not just spoken, doesn't ask to be believed. It commands it. And sometimes the strongest testimony doesn't come from words at all. It comes from the space left behind when all the lies collapse. And the only thing left standing is a woman in silence, daring the world to blink first. After the storm of silence had circled the nation, after the essays, The headlines, the echo of Jasmine's stillness. The air shifted, not with closure, but with a quiet challenge, unspoken yet unmistakable. What are you going to do with what you just saw? You can't walk away from what happened in that hearing room and pretend it was just another debate. You can't unhear the way DeSantis spun a lie so carefully wrapped in procedure that even silence had to fight to breathe. And you can't unsee the way Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. Not because she wasn't wounded, but because she refused to let their blade become her identity. This wasn't just a story of political contrast. It was a reckoning, a mirror held up not just to one man's tactics, but to a nation's habits. The quiet ones, the polite ones, the ones dressed up in language like standards and qualifications, but soaked in suspicion the moment someone like Jasmine steps into the room. This is not a call for sympathy, it's a call for action. Because what Jasmine endured in that moment, being asked to justify the validity of her life, her degree, her voice, is not unique. It's chronic. It's designed. And it thrives because too many people are still convinced that injustice has to shout to be real. But what if injustice whispers? What if it wears a tie? What if it says this is just a question, while holding a dagger behind its back? Then what? Then we stop waiting for fire and start listening for pressure. We begin by rejecting the performance, by refusing to let credentials become currency for basic respect, by understanding that no amount of degrees, citations, or hours spent proving yourself will ever be enough for those who never had to, because they don't actually want your proof. They want your exhaustion. They want your silence, not the dignified kind Jasmine wielded, but the defeated kind, the kind that gives up and says, maybe I don't belong here after all. And the moment you believe that, they've won. So this is where we draw the line, not just in congressional hearing rooms, but in hiring meetings, faculty lounges, scholarship reviews, and every whispered conversation that starts with, but do they really deserve it? Because the answer isn't in test scores. It's in what Jasmine said without speaking, that justice isn't earned by proving worth. Justice is the condition that assumes worth from the start. And if your system doesn't reflect that, it's broken. Not the student, not the applicant, the system. The call to action is this. Don't defend Jasmine, join her. When you hear someone question a student's presence because they got a scholarship, speak. When you hear a politician smear someone by implying their achievements are the product of favoritism, speak. When someone asks for documentation not out of due diligence but out of disbelief, speak. Because silence is only noble when it comes from power. When it comes from fear, it becomes complicity. We have to stop normalizing the burden of overproving. Because let's be honest, when DeSantis held up that unnamed, unverified paper, he wasn't really pointing at Jasmine. He was pointing at every black woman who's ever been told, you're only here because... He was pointing at every Latina law student who's ever hesitated before raising her hand in class. He was pointing at every immigrant child told that their story was inspiring, but not valid. That kind of gesture doesn't need a name. It's already branded into the culture. And that's what we must burn out. We must also name the courage of those who remember when others forget. Dr. Whitaker did more than testify. She restored a truth that had been twisted in real time. She didn't humiliate anyone. She didn't scream. She simply told the truth completely, and that made her dangerous. That's the kind of danger we need more of. Teachers who remember, witnesses who step forward, friends who post not to go viral, but to correct the record, and citizens who stop waiting for perfection before they act. Because acting doesn't mean being fearless. It means being fed up. It means knowing that if someone like Jasmine Crockett is still being asked to explain why she belongs, then the rot is deeper than we want to admit, and that the only way forward isn't through another round of hearings, it's through a culture shift, where suspicion is no longer our default, where we stop confusing doubt with critical thinking, where we learn that sometimes the greatest intelligence is knowing when to shut up and listen to those who have lived through more than we've read. So here's the challenge. To professors, look closer. You're not just teaching curriculum. You're watching battles you don't see written in the syllabus. To employers, stop hiring for pedigree and start hiring for grit. To politicians, If your power depends on undermining someone else's existence, then it's not leadership. It's cowardice. To the rest of us, stop asking for proof. Start asking what it costs them to show up, and whether you're willing to carry even an ounce of that weight yourself. Jasmine Crockett stood at the intersection of dignity and defiance, and she did not move. So now the question isn't, was she brave? The question is, are we? Are we brave enough to see how systems protect mediocrity in suits and punish brilliance in hoodies? Are we brave enough to stop calling people like Jasmine exceptions and start making sure they're the norm? Are we brave enough to rebuild not just access, but belief? The belief that those who've walked through fire don't need to be questioned, they need to be followed. Because here's what Jasmine showed us. The real revolution doesn't always scream. Sometimes it waits. And when it does speak, it doesn't ask for your permission. It asks for your reflection. And then it asks, what are you going to do now? But if you're still unsure what to do, if you're asking yourself, what difference can I make? Then hear this. You don't need a podium to shift a system. You don't need to hold office to challenge how power behaves. You just need to choose, in every room you enter, not to let silence become shelter for those who've always spoken last and been heard least. Speak when you hear erasure masked as formality. Interrupt when doubt is passed off as just asking questions. Intervene when someone calls a life like Jasmine's inspiring, but still tries to reduce her to a box on an admissions chart. Do it not to defend her, but to defend the future she fought for. Because the truth is, Jasmine didn't need saving. She needed witnessing. And in witnessing her, fully, honestly, without excuse, we come face to face with the world we've tolerated for too long. And if you're part of that world, if you've ever benefited from assumptions made in your favor, if you've ever walked into a room already believed, already trusted, then your call is even clearer. Use that trust to break the cycle. Use it not to speak over others, but to make sure their truth carries. Because sometimes the most radical thing you can do with privilege is pass the mic and stay. Don't vanish when the heat rises. Don't sit down when the stakes get personal. Stand there, stay there, and let history see where you were when it mattered. Because this moment wasn't just about Jasmine Crockett, it was about us. It was about whether we still believe in a country where worth isn't handed down, but earned through storms and scars and silence so sharp it rewires a room. And if we do, then this is the line we never cross again. No more manufactured doubt, no more anonymous sources, no more measuring resilience with tape measures built for privilege. From this point on, we believe Black women the first time. We recognize quiet as conviction, and we stop demanding receipts from the people who've paid the highest price just to stand where they stand. The next time someone like Jasmine walks into a room, let the question not be, is she qualified? Let the only question be, what will we do to be worthy of her presence? Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.